Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In episodes 24, 25, and 26, I showed you how to create a MAUI XAML app that authenticates users against 3 different identity providers: Microsoft, Twitter, and Google. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to do the same, but in a MAUI Blazor app. See, I'm partial to using MAUI Blazor. But as usual, it was difficult to find the little pieces of information I needed to put this demo together. So, building a MAUI Blazor app that uses MSAL to authenticate with the Microsoft Identity Provider against Azure AD B2C and call a secure web API is coming right up on the .NET show. So for this project, we're going to need the latest version of Visual Studio Professional 2022. We're going to need the ASP.NET and web development workload. And we're also going to need the MAUI workload. We're going to create an ASP.NET Core Web API project called Secure Web API. We're going to leave the defaults checked off. So before we do anything, let's just run the application. The template has Swagger built in by default, so you can test your API endpoints. So we have one for the weather forecast. Let's click Get, and then try it out, and execute. And look at that, everything works fine. Whoop-de-doo. All right, now we're going to secure it. So for that, we need a few NuGet packages. Going to go down to Package Manager Console, and we're going to say install package Microsoft ASP.NET Core.Authentication.jotbearer. We're going to do install package Microsoft.Identity.web. We're going to say install package Microsoft Identity.web.Microsoft Graph. And finally, we're going to say install package Microsoft.Identity Web UI. So this is what our CSproj file should look like. So next we're going to open Program.cs, and we're going to add these using statements at the top. And right after we create the builder, we're going to add this code right here. So we're adding authentication with the JotBearer defaults authentication scheme. We're going to add support for Microsoft Identity Web API using the Azure AD section and configuration. And off of that, we're hanging enable token acquisition to call downstream API. And we're adding Microsoft Graph. We're using the configuration Microsoft Graph section, which we'll get to. We're going to add in-memory token caches and add a downstream web API using a configuration that we have yet to do. Now we'll scroll down, and before use authorization, we'll say app.useAuthentication. Next, we're going to authorize the weather forecast controller, and we're going to do that by adding the authorize attribute to the entire controller. Now, when you do authentication and authorization with MSAL or Microsoft Identity or anything, there are certain secrets that you need to keep in your settings. So let's go to appsettings.json. I'm going to give you a template right here for all the settings that we're going to need. So we're going to need a tenant name. We're going to need a tenant ID and a client ID, a client secret. And we're also going to need to publish this with the secure web API URL. And that is the URL of this application that is running in Azure. All right. We won't know that until we actually go to publish it and find out what URLs are available. But we'll go do that, and then we'll come back here and put the URL to the application in the cloud right there. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the Azure portal, and we're going to create a new Azure AD B2C tenant. Now, if you already have an Azure Active Directory B2C tenant, great. But if you don't, here's how we create one. I'm going to go to create a resource. I'm going to search for Azure Active Directory and select Azure Active Directory B2C. You're going to click on Create. We're going to select this guy right here, create a new Azure AD B2C tenant. Now make sure you check off Azure Active Directory B2C, not just plain old Azure Active Directory. The B2C is what makes this work. And then we'll go to Configuration. So this is where you enter the name for your organization. I'm going to enter the .NET Show. Now the initial domain name, the .NET Show. And so that will be the .NET Show.onmicrosoft.com will be my domain. Now you select your subscription and your resource group. You can create a new one, whatever. I'm going to review and create. So after a few minutes, and I mean that, you'll see this message, tenant creation was successful. Click here to navigate to your new tenant. And here we are. So the first thing you're going to do is go to App Registrations and click New Registration. Now this application we're going to call MSAL Auth in MAUI Blazor. See that? As for the supported account types, we're going to select accounts in any identity provider or organizational directory for authenticating users with user flows. What that means is anybody, publicly. So if you want to limit it to any organizational directory, you can use that. Or if you only want accounts in your directory, the .NET Show only, that would be fine as well. But if we want publicly accessible authentication, you want to select this one. Now for the redirect URI, you want to select a platform, and we're going to start with single page web application. We're actually going to end up with all three, but let's start with a spa. And your redirect URI is going to be http://localhost. That's right, we're going to redirect to ourselves. Now make sure this grant admin consent is checked off and register. So now you notice we have some things here. We have the application client ID and we have the tenant ID or the directory ID. Let's copy the application or client ID into the clipboard and go back to Visual Studio. Remember, we have this spot right here replaced with your client ID. That's where we paste it. As for the tenant ID, copy that, put it here. Now, do you remember our tenant name? Mine is the .NET Show. I don't know what yours is. It's probably not the .NET Show. But that is our tenant name. So we're going to replace that wherever we see tenant name. All right, now the only other two things are the client secret and the base URL. So let's save this and go back to Azure. We're going to go to Authentication and add a platform. And we're going to choose Web. Now here's the pattern for the redirect URI. It's going to be https://. Now your tenant name. Mine is the .NET Show. Yours is going to be different. .b2clogin.com/ your tenant name again. .onmicrosoft.com/OAuth2/auth for auth response. All right. So you see that? Really important that you get this. This is my tenant name, the .NET Show. Your tenant name is going to be different. .b2clogin.com/ your tenant name .onmicrosoft.com/OAuth2/authresp. And make sure you check it twice for errors. Okay, now let's scroll down a little bit. You want to check off these two guys. The implicit grant and hybrid flows. We're going to select the tokens that we want to be issued by our endpoint. We want access tokens and we want ID tokens. We also want to check off yes for allow public client flows and click Save. Okay, now we're going to go to Certificates and Secrets, and we're going to add a new client secret. For the description, we're going to add MSAL auth in MAUI Blazor space secret, and you can select whatever expiration time you want for this secret. It just means that at the end of that period, you're going to have to come back and generate another secret. So for me, 6 months is fine. 3 months is fine, because I'm going to delete this before you even see everything. So you pick what you want. And then we're going to click Add. Now here's the thing, don't go away so fast. The value of this secret right here isn't going to stick around. You're not going to be able to copy this out of the portal again. So if you lose it, you have to generate a new one. But I just copied it into the clipboard, and now back in Visual Studio, I'm going to replace this right here with that secret. So the next thing we're going to do is create a scope. So we're going to click on Expose an API and add a scope. Now before you can add a scope, you have to follow the instructions. You have to set an application ID URI before you can add a permission. So this is essentially your tenantname.onmicrosoft.com / and your client ID. You can double check that by looking here. Yep, that's your client ID right there. So save and continue. The scope name will be access as user. For the admin consent display name, we're going to enter call the secure web API endpoints. That's the display name. Now the description is going to be allows the app to call the secure web API endpoints. Select add scope. Next, we're going to go to API permissions, and we're going to add a permission. I'm going to select my APIs, and here's the only one, MSAL auth in MAUI Blazor. You want to make sure delegated permissions is selected, and you want to check off access as user, and then select add permissions. Now it's very important before you go on. You see this down here, not granted, permission not granted. That's the status for access as user. You have to select grant admin consent for, and then whatever your tenant name is. Select yes, and now you get a little green check mark down there. That's very important. All right, back at the application. Let's run it and see what happens now. All right, so click Get, try it out, execute, and we should get, and yes we did, get a 401, which means an authentication error. So the next thing we need to do is deploy this to Azure. Now, if you know how to create a new web app in Azure and then download the profile, and you can publish using the profile and import that profile file, fine. But I already happen to know the URL that I want to publish to. So here it is right here. Let me close this. It's going to be https secure web API 3.azurewebsites.net. So it's going to be azurewebsites.net, but here's the thing that's going to be different. Secure Web API 3. I've already taken that. You can't use that. So you have to figure out some unique name for your API. And to tell you the truth, it really doesn't matter because nobody's going to be calling this except your code. So it doesn't need a domain name. You can just use azurewebsites.net. You get HTTPS for free. So there you go. Just pick a unique name, and that's where you're going to publish to. So once you have your published profile or you've created it from Visual Studio, you can go ahead and publish it. So you're going to get this 404 error, and that is expected because Swagger is only enabled running in development mode by default. Now, if you want to enable it for testing purposes, you can comment out these lines here in Program.cs. Okay, but if we want to test weather forecast directly, we paste that on there. Now we're getting a 401, which is not authorized. That means it's there, but we're not authorized. And that's good. So let's go back to our Azure AD B2C and now select identity providers. So look at this. This is where we can add identity providers, all these different platforms. Awesome. So we're going to just do Microsoft account today, but you can look through all of the ways that we've set up Google accounts and Twitter accounts and follow their instructions, and you can use them as well. So let's click on Microsoft account. So for the name, this should be pretty easy, Microsoft. But the client ID and client secret, guess where they're going to come from? You got it right here. Here's the client ID. Here's the client secret. And now we'll click Save. Now we can create a user flow. So the user flow is exactly what you think of. This is the flow of control that the user goes through, well, to do whatever. So we're going to create a new user flow, and this will be for sign up and sign in. There are also user flows for editing the profile, resetting the password, specifically signing up, specifically signing in, and then there's another one for using password credentials. But we're going to select sign up and sign in. And the recommended version, the generally available next generation user flow with the latest features. Click Create. Now it's up to you what you want to call it, but we're using a convention here, which we've already got in the config file, so we might as well use it. And it's social_SUSI for sign up, sign in, SUSI. We're going to select email sign up, right, for local accounts, and select our Microsoft identity provider. Now, local accounts means that users will be able to create accounts in your Azure AD B2C if they want to and use that to log into your application. And that's great because Azure will confirm their email address and all of that stuff, and you'll know who they are, and you will never have to access their passwords. Azure does all that for you. So it takes liability away from you because you don't own the data where their passwords are. That's good. Okay, scroll down and click Show More for user attributes and token claims. The only one we're going to pick here is display name. But you can, of course, add other attributes and token claims. And those are just pieces of data that you want to collect. So now click Create. So click on B2C One Social SUSI, and we can actually test it. Let's click Run User Flow. Now the application, the only one we have here is MSAL, Auth, and MAUI Blazor. You need to drop down Access Tokens and select MSAL, Auth, and MAUI Blazor. And then you can run the user flow. Now don't worry about all this here. You want to click Microsoft. And if you got this far, congratulations. You're halfway there. You don't even have to say yes right now. We'll say yes once the app is complete. Now let's get to MAUI. We're going to add to this solution a new project, which will be a .NET MAUI Blazor app called MSAL Auth in MAUI Blazor. Select the default framework, which is .NET 6 long-term support. So let's set this as the startup project. And go to our package manager console, and we're going to go up here and select MSAL Auth in Blazor because we want that to be the default project. When you select the default project and you add install packages, that's where they go. So here's what we want to install. Microsoft.identity.client in MSAL Auth in MAUI Blazor. Now we need 3 more packages. Microsoft Extensions Configuration Binder, Microsoft Extensions Configuration JSON, and Newtonsoft JSON. So in this application, we're going to add an appsettings.json file. Now you notice there isn't one here. Now you could just do this. You could just copy this appsettings.json up to here, and now you'd have it. That's the easiest thing to do. And then we're going to replace it with the template that's in my repo. So here you go. We have a place for the client ID, the tenant name, the tenant ID, and tenant name, tenant name, tenant name, our API service. So this should all be easy. Let me just snap my fingers and it'll be done. And there we go. And I'll just scroll over to make sure that you can see everything. Next, we're going to need a few files. I'm going to add Settings.cs. And these properties are going to match what's in my app settings file. And we're going to need nested settings, of course. Nested settings just has a string value. Now this is for scopes, and this is what MSAL expects. Okay, but sometimes we might need to pull out those values into a string array. So rather than having a nested settings array, let's add an extension to turn that into a string array. So we're going to add a class called Extensions. And all this does is it converts a nested settings array into a string array. Now we're getting into MSAL. So we're going to create a wrapper to call the PCA code, or the public client application code, that's available in the Microsoft Identity Client namespace. So it's going to be called PCA wrapper, but we're going to create an interface for it first. But all of this MSAL code is going to go in a folder called MSAL client. So we're going to add a folder called MSAL client. There it is. So in there, we're going to add a class, well, it's an interface, but we're going to call it IPCA wrapper. Okay, so here we have our string array scopes. Now you can see why we needed these extensions, because we need a string array for the scopes rather than an array of nested settings. So this is exposing a method called acquireTokenInteractive and another one called acquireTokenSilent, and they're both async. So you pass in the scopes and that acquires a token. It also has a signoutAsync method, but that's just the interface. Okay, now let's create the implementation. And here it is. And this is right out of Microsoft's documentation. So it's going to be a PCA wrapper class that implements IPCA wrapper. We pass in the configuration in the constructor, and we're also getting settings in the constructor from configuration get required section settings. And now we're converting scopes to a string array using our extensions to string array. And then we're creating a new public client application, a PCA. We're getting all these things from the settings except the redirect URI, which is set to localhost. Now we have a method for acquiring the token silently, which happens without user interaction. And if that doesn't work, we have this acquire token interactively, which does require user interaction. Now it's also asking for this platform config, which is a class we don't have yet, but we'll add it to our MSAL client folder. So this is for platform specific configuration, right? Now remember, this is a MAUI application, so the platform can change. But this way we can pull out that platform specific data, the redirect URI, the parent window, and we can get an instance of it with this get method. All right, now we're going to set up our PCA wrapper to be injected into our MAUI Blazor pages. So for that, we're going to go to MauiProgram.cs, and we're going to replace the whole thing with the code that's in our repo. We have to add our main page as transient, and after the weather forecast service, we're adding PCA wrapper as an IPCA wrapper, and the configuration. Next, we're going to open _imports.razor and add the following using statements. These three right here. Microsoft Identity Client, that's our MSAL. MSAL Auth and MAUI Blazor data, because that's where the weather forecast service is. And then system text JSON. Now, before we can call our PCA wrapper code to authenticate using MSAL.net, we're going to need a place to store our access token and it has to exist outside of all the pages. So we're going to add a Globals.cs file with this code right here. Just a string access token. That's it. Now we're ready to create login and logout buttons and use the PCA wrapper code to authenticate using MSAL.net. And we're going to do that in MainLayout, which is in shared. So here we have a couple using statements at the top that we're going to need. We're injecting our PCA wrapper and configuration. We have our nav menu as a sidebar. That doesn't change. And now we have this div that checks a Boolean is logged in. If we're logged in, we're going to have a button for logging out. If we're logged out, we're going to have a button for logging in. So here we have our is logged in Boolean. If we set that, then we're going to call invoke status changed, because that means there's some UI here, specifically this, that has to change. Now when we click login, we're going to try silently first, right? We pass the scopes, configure await false, and then we set the access token to result access token only if the result is not null. And now there's a possibility here that Global's access token will be null. So we'll check to see if it's not null, and if it isn't, that means we're logged in. We have an access token, so I'll set is logged in to true. If we have a problem, that might be because this is the first attempt to log in, or after logging out, or something is preventing the silent login from happening. So we're going to try an interactive login. So now we're going to call acquire token interactive. And the same thing, we're going to set the access token, and if it's not null, we're logged in. So that's it. That's the login code. And now on log out, we're just going to call sign out async, logged in is false, set the global access token to null. What could be easier? Now, obviously, our weather forecast service has to change, because what this is doing is it's just generating bogus data. But right here, we want to pass this on to our API, right? Our secure web API has the weather forecast controller that is authorized. Now, obviously, it's just weather data, right? But this would be your remote API. So we're going to reuse this weather forecast service to forward our requests on to that secure API. So here we go. We're injecting the configuration, and we're getting the settings from that configuration. And we have a method called call secure web API. Now, obviously, this is just a demo, right? So you might have multiple calls in here in your service. Maybe it's one service, one call. Maybe it's one service, multiple calls, whatever. But you name it whatever you want. So if we don't have an access token, we're bailing, right? Now we create a new weather forecast. We create an HTTP client. And now we're creating an HTTP message, which is a GET message. It's an HTTP request message, passing in the URL, which is from settings, the API URL, right? API URL right there, and weather forecast. So this is the key right here. We're adding our access token using message.headers.add authorization. That is a well-known header. And then it's going to be bearer space globals.access token. This is the token. So now we're going to send the request, get a response. I'm going to read that response as a string. Make sure it's not empty. Again, we have to tell it to be case insensitive because it's case sensitive by default. I don't know why. It's a pain in the butt, but okay. And then we're going to deserialize that response string with those options and then ensure success. Because if this is not successful, we're bailing. Otherwise, we return the result. Now, finally, we need to go to our pages fetch data, and we have to change this. Obviously, we don't like get forecast async. We're going to change that to call secure web API. But here's the thing. This returns a list of weather forecast. Let's just change this to list of weather forecast. So let's go ahead and run this on our Windows machine. Now we're getting this error here because I forgot a step. All right, this is basically saying we don't know anything about this, configuration thing. So here's why. Go over to your appsettings.json, and you're going to set the build action to embedded resource, and go ahead and select copy if newer. All right, that's really important. Otherwise, we can't see it. Let's try it again. All right, now I told you about this issue before where we have this huge window, right? Well, tune in because next week I'm going to tell you how Microsoft actually addressed this problem. All right, so here we go. We have a hello world. We go to counter, we go to fetch data, we get nothing because we're not logged in. Let's go to log in. Another window pops up. We can sign in with Microsoft. And we're going to select yes to let this app access our info. Here's our user details, Carl Franklin. And now we're going to get this. Authentication complete. You can return to the application. Now the application now says log out up here, right? Because we called state has changed. And that re-renders. So now if I go to fetch data, loading, boom! And it works. Isn't that awesome? All right, this is great for Windows app, but what about Android? The most popular platform for mobile phones. Let's do that next. All right, first thing let's do is go to the platforms folder and then open Android. And in here, we have this Android manifest. See that? Double click that. We're going to replace it with what's in the repo. All we're doing here is we're telling the application that we need these particular permissions. We need to access the network state. We need to access the internet, of course. And now we've got some queries. We've just got a lot of goo here that you don't really have to understand, but it has to be in here. Now we're going to create under MSAL client a class called MSAL activity. Now here's what this does. We have this activity with an intent filter, and the intent filter has some attributes here. One of them is the data scheme, which is going to be MSAL and our client ID. Boy, if I only knew what our client ID was. Yeah, let's just pull it out of app settings. There it is. And notice there's no space here. It's MSAL client ID. Now we have to modify our main activity as well, which is in the Android folder. We're going to override onCreate, and we're using our platform config instance for the redirect URL in the parent window. We also have this Android redirect URI, and it's got a sort of a GUID kind of a unique string right there. And that's fine. Now we have an override for onActivityResult, which we need for authentication, the authentication continuation helper. And now here's the other thing. If we run this now on our Android phone, we won't be able to see that top bar. So we're going to also add it to the shared nav menu razor. And it's mostly the same stuff that we use to log in, right? Our on logged out or on logged in. And now we have our is logged in, the logged in clicked. It's the same stuff. Now there's one more step that we need in Azure. Go to your app registration. Go to Authentication. We're going to add a platform. And it's going to be mobile and desktop applications down here. We're going to check off both of these. And for the custom redirect URL, I'm going to go to main activity and copy this guy right here, MS Auth, all of it. And that goes right here in custom redirect URIs. Now there's one more thing that we have to do, and that is to go to our PCA wrapper, and right here where we use this redirect URI, we're going to replace that with this directive. If not Android, we're going to say with redirect URI localhost. That doesn't work for Android. All right, now I'm going to run it on my phone. And I'm using a program called PhoneLink for Windows so that I can see my Android phone screen in Windows. And I can also use it. So let's go to Login. I'm going to sign in with Microsoft. I'm going to enter my password and sign in. And now, log out. That means I'm logged in. Great. Fetch data? Yes. So look at that. Now we can have a MAUI application that we write with Blazor that does authentication. And I showed it to you working in Windows, working in Android. Well, that's all I got today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Please visit blazortrain.com and the .NETshow.com for more great content.